So this week we're continuing our coverage of psychological disorders, and this particular section is going to be about mood disorders. As a reminder, whenever we're getting started on a talk of psychological disorders, we're going to be covering some fairly heavy topics. We're going to be talking about things like suicide and self-harm, as well as potentially talking about sexual abuse and drug use and other things that you might find challenging or difficult to hear. So just keep that in mind as we go through, that is on the table and a part of the conversation when we talk about psychological disorders. So last week I introduced you to two different families of disorders, anxiety disorders and dissociative disorders. Now we're moving into a third family, mood disorders. And when we're talking about mood disorders, that's a selection of disorders where the mood is disturbed severely. So here's how we tend to think about the range of emotions as taken directly from your book. It's very normal to feel a range of emotions, but most of us tend to stick toward the middle, where you might get a little bit sad during the course of the day or a little bit happy during the course of the day. The key thing with mood disorders is that moods are extreme, so extreme sadness and extreme elation, or kind of like a euphoric happiness that's very, very strong and powerful. Those are considered to be a little bit rarer and therefore fall within the range of deviance. Also, when those moods are extreme, they can be a source of distress, even when it's extreme elation, which I'm going to talk about when we talk about mania. And lastly, those extreme moods can cause dysfunction in daily life and relationships. So keep in mind, this is how mood disorders fulfill the 3 Ds. Another thing you might see with mood disorders is fluctuation between extreme emotions, which we'll talk about when we talk about bipolar disorder. Okay, major depressive disorder is the big kahuna. It's the most common mood disorder, and it's one of the most common disorders that people have. If you'll remember that chart from last week, the two major highest numbers were mood disorders and anxiety disorders, and depression was toward the top of the list in terms of the number of people who have it. With major depressive disorder, someone would be severely depressed and it would have no external cause. So once again, if somebody's in deep mourning because they might have lost a loved one recently, that's considered to be a normal precipitating factor for a depressed mood. If someone has no precipitating factor, no particular reason why they're feeling depressed, then that would be where it gets to the point of it being a disorder. Your reading for the week, Ali Brosh's Hyperbole and a Half, Adventures in Depression, Part 1 and 2, covers her experiences with depression. So as we're going through this particular section, be thinking about Ali and her experiences. Also, there's room in the discussion forum for you to talk a little bit more about the reading. And as a reminder, you will be responsible for the reading on your exam. So some of the emotional symptoms of major depressive disorder include a very low mood, which is associated with feeling worthless. Oftentimes people report feeling disconnected from their surroundings, like they're wrapped in cotton and can't connect with anyone. Anhedonia is a fun word. We talk about hedonism to be an excess of the senses. Someone who's a hedonist eats too much and drinks too much and kind of flings themselves around enjoying all of life's pleasures. Anhedonia is a lack of ability to feel pleasure. So someone who is anhedonic has an inability to experience pleasure from things that used to make them happy. There's also behavioral symptoms, which include low motivation and low energy. So someone who is in a depressive episode finds that they have a sense of inertia. It's very hard to to feel like they're up for doing any sort of task, which you can see could contribute to dysfunction when it comes to ability to do things like hold down a job or engage in relationships with other people. There's also sleep and eating disruptions, which can take a variety of forms. Sometimes people sleep too much, sometimes they can't sleep. Sometimes they eat too much, sometimes they have no appetite. So we see a lot of variety here in terms of the forms that this can take. There's also occasionally things like joint pain that can sometimes happen with depression, just general aches and pains. On a side note, if you'll remember, when we were talking about neurotransmitters back before spring break, one of the things we talked about is how a lot of serotonin, which is responsible for mood regulation, is actually in our digestive system, in our gut. And so thinking through how sometimes disruptions in serotonin can be marked by problems with our digestion is an interesting connection to think about. And also addressing some of the challenges that some people have with depression through things like probiotics, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about therapies next week. Let's talk about some other mood disorders besides major depressive disorder. So all of these fall under the umbrella of mood disorders. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder where there's periods of mood that range from normal to manic, and sometimes there are episodes of depression and sometimes there aren't. A manic episode tends to be an episode where the person is in an extreme state of elation. So once again, that extreme positive end of the scale. But here's the thing, it's not necessarily very fun. Now, sometimes people who are in the middle of a manic episode can claim to feel fantastic. But what they end up doing is they end up staying up until 4 o'clock in the morning, working on the great American novel, not sleeping, not eating. They get irritable. They have racing thoughts. When they try to share their work with other people, it's hard for them to understand. So someone who's manic is running very, very hot, sometimes too hot, and they often end up burning out. So we think of mania as this sense of grandiosity. I am unbeatable. I am the best person ever. Their thoughts are racing very fast. And that elation, that extreme happiness, can actually have sometimes an irritable edge, especially if they're interrupted in the middle of their work. And once again, they can't slow down. They can't sleep. They can't calm down. It's a sense of extreme amounts of energy, right? There's 2 different types of bipolar. With bipolar 1, it's just mania versus a normal emotional state. So you vacillate between mania and a normal state. With bipolar 2, you have mania, a normal state, and depression. Hypomania is like a lower level of mania where it's not quite a full manic episode. Sometimes people in manic episodes can get so worked up that they need to be hospitalized in order to be adequately treated. It can be a severe type of disorder, even though someone in the middle of that particular episode might not necessarily recognize they're in a manic state, and once again might claim to feel really good. Oftentimes with bipolar 2, what we see is that at the end of a manic episode, there's often a crash that results in or triggers a depressive episode. So people overwork and then they burn themselves out and they end up slipping into a depressive state. Once again, hypomania is less severe than mania, but it's still got that manic edge to it. Dysthymia is a form of mood disorder that's a little bit like the generalized anxiety disorder of mood disorders. So whereas generalized anxiety disorder was a low-level worry, dysthymia is a low-level depressive state that's long-lasting and persistent. So it lasts for 6 months or more, and it's a low level of depression. So it's not severe depression, but it's still a state of depression that lasts for a long time and can impede your ability to live a normal life. There are different things that can happen to trigger depression sometimes that are hormonally based. So major depressive disorder has no precipitating factor. These other things do have distinct precipitating factors that we'll talk about. So postpartum depression is incredibly common. Immediately following birth, The person who's given birth has a crash in their hormones, and this can sometimes trigger a depressive episode. Birth can be a traumatic experience. You might have to recover from surgery. Your body is going through all sorts of very dramatic changes very quickly, and you often have a lack of sleep. And an infant who's highly dependent on you is its sole source of nutrition. So that can combine to create a perfect storm where very often new mothers can experience postpartum depression. This is far rarer, but sometimes individuals can experience postpartum psychosis. So in the case of postpartum psychosis, this is usually triggered by people who have a history of bipolar disorder in their family, and it's associated with thought disturbances and hallucinations. So for example, someone in a state of postpartum psychosis might believe that their children are somehow possessed by the devil and that they must free them from their bodies in order to send them to heaven. So every now and then you might read a story of a new mother who does something inexplicable, like drive a car into a lake or drown her kids in a bathtub. And you might go, what's going on there? This is very often a potential source of some of those unusual behaviors that we see where there's a full psychotic episode triggered by the sudden drop in hormones, and this can be a result. Sometimes there can be, once again, thoughts of harming the child that can be a persistent problematic thing. I have actually known someone who's gone through postpartum psychosis. Her husband was a clinician friend of mine, and she had it triggered for both of her births in the last 4 years. It was very hard for their family. The first time around, they were completely unprepared. It took them all by surprise. She had to be committed, and it was a very challenging time for that family. It's frightening to go through this. It's very rare, but it does happen every now and then. And once again, postpartum psychosis can often come with aggression. PMDD is where depressive episodes are triggered by the change in hormones that accompany menstrual cycles. You might sense a theme here, where if there's a sudden and dramatic shift in hormones, then that can sometimes trigger depression. With people with PMDD, if they have a menstrual cycle, they can clock depressive episodes monthly. Oh, here's when I'm going to get a depressive episode, and it corresponds directly with drops in hormones. So you can see how hormonal changes can lead to depression under very specific circumstances. Also, on a side note, women do tend to be more susceptible to mood disorders. Another type of mood disorder is seasonal affective disorder, where the precipitating factor is a lack of exposure to vitamin D. So oftentimes people during the winter months will experience a mood disorder caused by low levels of sunlight. And you often see this in northern climates especially. So sometimes, for example, people in Norway might look under a sun lamp during part of the months in order to kind of boost their exposure to sun. So people in northern climates will often mitigate seasonal affective disorder by increasing their vitamin D through sun lamps. So when it comes to causes of a disordered mood, the different theoretical perspectives provide different potential causes. The behavioral theorists would talk about learned helplessness. I'm not sure if you remember reading this part of your book back when we talked about learning toward the beginning of the semester, but if you'll remember in the learning chapter, it talked about the dogs who were being shocked and how that established a state of learned helplessness. Do you remember that? Hopefully you do. Anyways, what they did was they set up a chamber where the floor was electrified, and dogs were put into the chamber, and the floor was electrified at random, and they had no way of controlling it and no way of escaping it. And after a while of this exposure, the dogs simply lay down and took the shock. Later, when the dogs were placed into another chamber that had a wall that they could easily jump over to escape the shock into an area that didn't have shock, they didn't take that opportunity. whereas dogs who hadn't been exposed to the shocks earlier immediately jumped over the wall and were able to be saved. So a behaviorist would take a look at that and go, sometimes we can learn a state of passivity and helplessness through continual exposure to things that are outside of our control and that happen at random to us. And that can be a precipitating factor for potentially understanding depression. We already talked a little bit about distorted and illogical thinking in our last unit when we talked about anxiety disorders. Cognitive theorists would say the same sort of thing when thinking about disordered mood. So for example, that all or nothing thinking, it must be perfect, or I might as well not try at all. Magnification and minimization. I'm a loser and I will always be a loser for all time. And this good thing that happened is a fluke and a rarity, and I'm just a loser. So those sorts of illogical thinking patterns can be what can contribute to disordered mood in terms of a spiraling thought pattern that's very challenging to break out of. One of the things we've explored is levels of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine in the brain. We're going to talk a lot more about this when we talk about treatment for these disorders. But for example, for depression, we have found that people who have depression typically have lower amounts of serotonin and dopamine in their brain, and that people with mania tend to have high levels of norepinephrine, high levels of dopamine, and lower levels of GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that helps you calm down. One of the things we'll talk about when we talk about therapies next week is how, for some people, increasing the amount of serotonin and dopamine in their system can help with their depressive symptoms. One key to understand, though, is that this only works for some people some of the time. It doesn't work for all people, indicating that there's a little bit more complicated things at work besides simply upping our serotonin and dopamine as a way to potentially think about treating depression. Also, biological explanations would point to the fact that depression can have a heritability component to it. So using identical twin studies and comparing identical twins' level of depression and rates of depression and how much depression is correlated with fraternal twins helps establish the degree of heritability. So while we're on the subject of depression, it's important to talk about suicide awareness and prevention. I always include this in my talks, and I think it's really important to include this time around as well, especially because people are getting lonely, they're getting isolated, and that can be a trigger for depression. So I wanted to talk just a little bit more about suicide prevention. Also, as a reminder, I do include a link to a video about loneliness, so you can watch a little bit more about that as we're exploring mood disorders and what can be a potential underlying thing that goes on that contributes to depression. So suicide is the 10th leading cause of death for Americans, and there are a few distinct risk factors. People tend to commit suicide more or attempt suicide more as they get older, so age can be a potential factor. Substance use can be a factor, and sudden change in depression medication can often lead to a combination of increased energy levels and still feeling really under the weather and low in mood. So a change in medication can often be a high risk for people attempting suicide. Suicide contagion is a phenomenon whereby if a public figure commits suicide and it's successful, then the publication of the stories about that can lead to a wave of copycat suicides. So there's actually journalistic standards for how to talk about that involve not glorifying it and not discussing the method used, and using very careful language standards when talking about it to prevent contagion. So less drama, less explicitness, less extensive coverage tends to be responsible journalistic standards to prevent contagion in the case of a highly public figure. When it comes to warning signs to look at, once again, the warning signs can include sudden changes in mood, and can often include an attempt to give away belongings, to talk in vague sort of terms about what it would be like if they weren't around. The most immediate risk is when people say, I'm thinking about committing suicide. And it's important when somebody talks about that, even if they treat it like it's a joke, to think about it seriously. And if someone says, I'm thinking about this, to direct them to appropriate intervention. So I have the hotline for suicide prevention at the top of the page. It's super easy to Google. And it's important to, for example, ask the person to call you back the next day to check in, and to direct them to a hotline they can call, and to take that sort of thing as seriously as you can, and to know the warning signs, and to just be appropriate and responsible. I think it's important to have understanding about this particular phenomenon, and the more education we have, the better when it comes to how we approach it in our everyday lives.